Saga of Tord.
It was the bluest planet any of them had ever seen, much bluer than it appeared in the holograms. Everyone who was awake stood together on the bridge as they passed the planet's lone, ashen moon, and as the good ship Albatross 9 drew closer, it became clear that it was no illusion. Since the last visit, the planet's topography had radically changed. Where did all that damn water come from? Captain Kepler didn't like that the map didn't match the terrain, even when the explanation was so simple that last time most of the globe was covered in ice. Now only the poles were covered in ice. Most of the planet was underwater now, and it was beautiful. It was as if the whole globe was teeming with life, a lone gem in a pile of rubble. Kepler felt a bit of concern. Could it be that the temple had ended up underwater even though it was built on a high mountain? A volcanic eruption, or a meteor for that matter. A lot can happen in 30,000 years.
At the same time on the beautiful blue planet, Ironfoot.
When King Olafur united the kingdom, Bjarne Madsen Ironfoot was ruler of Boland. He was an important man for the king, as without his allegiance, Olafur would never have been able to conquer the islands to the north without the loss of many lives, and that he could ill afford. After having slain the Earl of Vega in single combat and declared himself king, together with a handful of men, Olafur set sail for Boland to confer with Bjarne Ironfoot. King Olafur gave his word that the kingdom would not have to worship new gods, and that no new laws would be enacted in regard to sacrificial ceremonies and funeral bonfires. The people of Boland would be allowed to live as they always had. Olafur gave this solemn promise in the presence of Bjarne and his men. In his turn, Bjarne Ironfoot pledged loyalty to the king. Thus spoke Ironfoot: "It takes great courage or great foolhardiness to venture north to rule the land. Had you come with armed men and longships, I would have said that you were a fool indeed. But you have come in good faith, Olafur, and you have kept your word. This tells me that you are a wise man. We may well need a man of courage for king, but even more a man possessed of great wisdom. This day you may very well have saved the lives of many brave men, and that is the deed of a stout-hearted man. So hear this, from here to the ice coast in the north, hear this to the Blacklands of the south, hear this in the east to the Silver Hills, and hear this across the ocean to the wastelands. Bjarne Madsen Ironfoot herewith lays down his sword before King Olafur." So, saying, Ironfoot laid his sword at the king's feet, and Olafur knelt and solemnly swore to protect him and all his people. What the king could not know, but all those present could see, was that the sword Bjarne had laid at the feet of the new king was not his own sword, Little Shaver, but another sword Oslak the blacksmith had forged for Ironfoot's son before he was born. This sword had never drawn blood and did not yet have a name. Ironfoot knew precisely what he was doing, as like most of the people of Boland, he was of two minds in regard to the new king. The time had come to unite under one banner, as Ironfoot had himself declared many times, but he was by no means sure that Olafur was the right man for the task. It was widely rumored that at times his men had been too heavy-handed and had plundered the homes of defeated enemies who had met them in fair fray on the battlefield. Ironfoot was very well aware of this, yet swore fealty to the king, and promised to provide 5 fully manned longships should the king need them in battle. King Olafur never again set foot on Boland. There were many in the north who did not look upon him as their king, and who would have preferred Ironfoot to rule over them, though it was not wise to say so in his presence. It angered Ironfoot, as he knew all too well how such idle talk could be twisted and spread throughout the country, so that by the time it came to the ears of King Olafur, it would appear that Ironfoot might be on his way from the north to seize the throne. Whispering and muttering and speaking vaguely have been the cause of more wars than resounding calls to arms, declared Ironfoot. For 5 successive summers in his youth, Ironfoot had taken part in raids in the east, as he was both strong and adept with longbow and battle-axe before he was 20. The raiders sailed on the spring equinox, returning in the summer laden with plundered treasures. When war broke out among the petty kings of the Western Isles in the Eastern Sea, Bjarne was 28 and powerful enough to fit out and man his own longship, Draug. Bjarne had overseen its construction from felling of the timber from which it was built till its launch. He wanted Draug to be the longest and fastest ship on the ice coast, and so it proved to be. Ironfoot hired the ship out, along with the warriors who manned it, to whoever was prepared to pay, though without swearing allegiance to any of them. By the time the wars came to an end, Ironfoot and his men had served all 4 earls in their struggle for power. It was said that no one won the war, but that Ironfoot was the only one who didn't lose. That was one of the reasons why he elected to throw in his lot with King Olafur. He had seen with his own eyes what prolonged war to attain the throne resulted in. Ironfoot was willing to do all he could to maintain peace, even if meant less power for himself. Ironfoot acquired his name when he had to have his leg amputated while returning home from the final battle in the east. He was slashed across the foot with a violent sword blow. He lost 7 good men in that battle. In time, the wound might have healed itself had blood poisoning not set in. On his way home, under sail in the middle of the ocean, he told Eric the Strong to cut off his foot just below the knee. Eric thanked him for the honor. Ironfoot was given a piece of dried fish to bite on while 2 of his men held him firmly in their grip. Eric raised his sword, Burn, swinging his mighty blade, chopping off Ironfoot's leg with a single blow, exactly where indicated. "Well done, Eric," said Ironfoot, "but now your sword has tasted your master's blood, and for that reason it can no longer serve me." Ironfoot told Eric to throw his sword, still dripping with blood, overboard. He did as he was ordered, though it broke his heart, as it was a grand and trusted sword that still thirsted for blood after having slain hundreds of men. Eric was about to cast Bjarne's amputated foot overboard too, when Bjarne stopped him. "I must know how much the flesh I have lost weighs," he said. "Get a scale and weigh it." When they got back to Boland, Ironfoot ordered Oslak the blacksmith to make him a foot of iron. He said that it should weigh exactly the same as the foot he had lost. He was very insistent, and Oslak spent much time and labor before the foot was exactly to his master's specification. With this new foot of iron he could once again walk, but never again run. The genius thing about his new acquisition was that with it he was able to ride as if he had 2 sound legs. When he was wearing boots, it was impossible for a stranger meeting him on horseback to know that it was Ironfoot himself riding by. Ironfoot's wife, Anna Danius, was the youngest sister of Torgeir Boss, ruler of the island of Vesta, with whom Ironfoot had sailed south in his youth. Ironfoot and Anna had twin daughters, Arnhild and Magnhild. He proudly taught them all he would have taught a son, and they both became better archers and riders than any of his men. Ironfoot loved his daughters, so much so that he once felled a man at the Canstadnes market for speaking with lust of his 2 girls, without realizing that it was Ironfoot himself he was talking to. Ironfoot laughed heartily every time he told the tale. When his daughters were nearly grown up and Ironfoot had lived in peace in Boland for many years, Anna gave birth to a son. Ironfoot's joy would have known no bounds had not Anna died in childbed. Ironfoot tore his hair and took to his bed, where he drank his way through the winter, leaving his daughters to take care of the baby, whom the girls named Thord. In Thord's first year, Ironfoot showed as little interest in the boy as he did in the world about him, but when the year came to an end and the boy began to walk, he rose from his bed and began to move about again. When the little boy began to talk, Ironfoot pulled himself together, and after having only mumbling nonsense to himself following his wife's death, began to speak normally and hold conversations like before. Although he still mourned the death of his wife, it was plain to all that thanks to the little boy, he had regained his zest for life. The consequence was that the people of Boland, and those living in the islands further to the north, re-attained their faith in the future. It was commonly said that Ironfoot from Boland was beside himself with grief, which occasioned much disquiet and uncertainty. But Ironfoot eventually regained his former good health, and his delight in his son was remarked upon by all who witnessed it. Ironfoot set about teaching his son to ride, sail and hunt before the boy was 5. Thord was a strong and happy young lad, with a head of long, fair, curly hair, like his late mother and his sisters. People said that when Thord reached manhood, he would make a fine chief of Boland. But one day when Thord was almost 10 years old and Ironfoot was sailing westward to avenge his brother Leif, the boy was out playing with some of his friends when, without warning, he fell writhing to the ground, frothing at the mouth. He was taken home and put to bed, and his sisters watched over him day and night, but 3 nights later, young Thord passed away. Pending his father's return, his body was laid in a mound on Boland Point. It was a sad time for the people of Boland. Fear of King Olafr's men lay heavily over the island by the time Ironfoot returned from the west with the head of his brother's killer hanging from the mast. On his father's order, Thord's remains were cremated, Bjarne Ironfoot himself lighting the funeral pyre. Every man present dropped to one knee with swords in front of them, heads bowed. Ironfoot then spoke as follows: "A future up in smoke, another future comes. Why this the gods have done, I shall never understand." That Ironfoot chose to have his boy's body cremated rather than laid in a burial mound gave rise to some comment in the region, and many people were afraid of how King Olafr would respond when he heard the news. For although the king permitted sacrifice and worship of the old gods, people never ceased to wonder if he himself was a believer in the one almighty God. After taking leave of his son, Ironfoot again took to his bed, where he resumed his drinking and cursed the gods for having taken so much from him. He had grown deeply embittered, so much so that when people heard the Ironfoot approach, they all scattered before he could arrive. Arnhild and Magnhild were the only ones able to get a good word out of him. That apart, he showed not the slightest interest in what was taking place around him, be it in Boland or the kingdom at large. It fell to his daughters to attend to his affairs, and this they did with great success.
A ship with torn sails.
One day in August, the year after Thord's death, Arnhild and Magnhild sailed Draug south to Stok Island to deliver a cargo of herring in return for grain. South of Boland Point, they spotted a drifting ship, and in accordance with the law of the sea, sailed closer to render assistance, as was the law. If the ship had been abandoned, it would be theirs. However, as they drew near, they realized that it was a vessel alien to these waters, and that it had suffered badly from wind and weather, its sails all tattered and torn. The ship was too big to take in tow, and as there was no sign of life, Arnhild and Magnhild decided to carry on to Stok Island. They reasoned that they could conclude their business there, and on the return voyage put in at Nistrond, a long strip of beach where, provided the wind continued to blow from the west, the drifting ship would finally come to rest. The matter settled, they carried on to Stok Island, where they completed their business without a word to anyone of what they intended to do. Without wasting time, Arnhild and Magnhild sailed Draug to Nistrond, where they found the strange ship beached on a sandbank, just as Arnhild had predicted. They brought Draug alongside the stranded ship. Axes at the ready, Halvar Eagle and Gunnar Badger boarded her. Finding no sign of life on deck, they went below to search the hold for cargo. Shortly afterwards they came stumbling back to Draug, and a visibly shaken Halvar Eagle said that the hold was full of dead bodies, men, women and children, one and all in chains. They were clearly from a far-off land. Gunnar Badger suggested the ship was a slaver, something they had heard talk of but never seen. But one thing Gunnar did know: if it really was a slave ship, it had to be burned without delay, otherwise it would bring evil and misfortune to Boland. On hearing this, the sisters decided to follow Gunnar's advice and set fire to the ship, together with its grisly cargo. Arnhild and Magnhild ordered their men to take down what was left of the rigging, and not least all the valuable chainwork, before torching the wreck. Halvar returned to the ship with 5 men and led them into the hold. They saw that all the dead had long dark hair, and men, women and children alike, tattoos on their backs. Brynjar Scarface thought they looked like people of the ice Eskimos. Eskimos are useless as slaves, said Halvar Eagle. Torgir, Brynjar's brother, said the ship might have been bound for hell and that the dead were lost souls, bound for the netherworld. Angered, Halvar bade Torgir hold his tongue and set about the task in hand. He and his men then began dismantling the rigging. That done, they went below to retrieve the manacles, only to find that it was no problem wrenching them loose from the hull, but a different matter entirely to get them off the dead. Halvar decided that the only solution was to saw their legs off. Then they'll wake up in Valhalla, he said. All agreed that this was a good way of solving the matter, both for the living and the dead. The task of removing the chains was assigned to the youngest of the men, Arnfinn and Birger. Mere boys, neither of them had ever used an axe on a human being before, so Halvar Eagle said this would be a good time to start. The two went below and set to work, while Halvar and the rest of the men gathered together all that remained of value after the storm. They scoured the ship for anything worth saving, working all through the bright summer night in order to be ready before high water. They had almost completed their task when, to their great surprise, they saw Ironfoot galloping towards them on the shore. No one had seen him on a horse since his son died, so they were both gladdened and worried by this unexpected sight. Halvar waded ashore to greet the unexpected newcomer, and just had time to greet him before Ironfoot burst out, "I had a dream, Halvar Eagle, that there were some dead crows on the mountain, and that I had lit a fire to burn them. But when I had burnt them all but one, the last of them suddenly rose up, spread its wings and flew off." "What did the dream mean?" Halvar Eagle asked. "That I do not know," Ironfoot replied, "but I do know that it had to do with this ship." He then asked Halvar Eagle take him on his back and carry him out to the ship so that he could see for himself what was in the hold. Arnhild and Magnhild were glad to see their father back on horseback again. They told him about how they had sailed to Stock Island and out in the open sea had come across the drifting ship with its tattered sails and broken mast. They also told him of how they had left it to the wind to blow the ship to where they had found it, and how their wish had been fulfilled. Ironfoot was pleased with what his daughters had done and told them so. "Now we must remember to thank Odin," he said. Ironfoot agreed with his daughters that the best thing to do would be to burn the ship, but wished to be shown over it first. Before he could say more, they heard a bone-chilling cry from the hold, and, shouting and screaming, Arnfinn, the blacksmith's youngest son, stumbled onto the deck, blood pouring from between the fingers of his hands that were clasped over his eyes. Birger, his companion, followed hot on his heels, blue in the face, gasping for breath, and with his hand to his throat. Both fell writhing to the deck. Arnfinn, who from then on was to be known as Arnfinn the One-Eyed, screamed at the top of his voice, "My eye! The demon took my eye!" Still sputtering and gasping for breath, Birger lay speechless, hands to his throat. He appeared to be strangling himself with his own hands. "It was the last of them," Arnfinn gasped. "He wasn't dead at all." The men gathered around them, stood frozen to the spot, all eyes on the open hatch from which the two men had appeared. To a man, they deeply regretted having boarded the wreck without their weapons. Now, here they were with only Ironfoot's sword to protect them from an unseen being who had just torn an eye from one of their number and attempted to strangle another. But now all seemed to be over. There wasn't a sound from the hold, and after a while, without a word, as one man they turned to Ironfoot. They had not seen him for a long time, but now it was clear to them all that he had aged considerably. Before he could speak, Gunnar Badger said, "My lord, none of us have our weapons with us. All we have are saws and carpenter's axes. Lend me your sword. Give me Little Shaver, and I will go down and slay whatever it was that has done this to our young men." At this, Bjarne drew his sword from its scabbard, weighed it in both hands, then, without a word, drove it into the deck before him with such force that the planking splintered. The only sound came from Birger as he lay unnoticed, still gasping for breath. Then Bjarne spoke. "I know you are a brave man, Gunnar Badger, and I thank you for your prowess and your loyalty. You will always overcome the enemies that cross your path. But if there is a demon aboard this ship, then that demon has come for me. I shall go into the hold alone." Ironfoot's men were in a quandary. Did their chieftain intend to go below alone to do battle with an enemy that had just seriously wounded two strong young men? It was left to Magnhild to put into words what none of the men dared say. She went up to her father, grasped little Shaver by the hilt and said, "You know better than anyone that there is a time and a place in which to do battle. For you, father, this is the time, but it is not the place. And if the demon has come for you, it will come for me too, should you fall. And fall I fear you will, father, if you go into that hold alone." Ironfoot glared at his daughter, but he uttered not a word. His eyes moved from one daughter to the other. Then Magnhild spoke again. "I'm coming with you." "So am I," said Arnhild, stepping forward to place her hand on the hilt of the sword. The men stood aghast, expecting their chieftain to put his daughters in their place. No chieftain worth his salt would allow a son to speak to him in such a manner, and certainly not before his men. They didn't know where to look while they waited for Ironfoot's reply, for although their chieftain was a wise and honourable man, he was renowned for his hot temper, but Ironfoot uttered not a word. Instead he laid his own hand on little Shaver's hilt on top of Arnhild's and Magnhild's, and nodded 3 times. "So be it," he said. At that very same moment there occurred something that was to be long talked about in the country. When Ironfoot tried to wrest little Shaver from the deck, it would not move an inch. He braced himself and tried again, but still the sword would not come loose. He then tried working it to and from, but still it was in vain. Then, without warning, there was a loud clang, and Ironfoot found himself with the hilt and half the blade in his hands. The rest of the sword remained firmly where it was, fast in the deck. Little Shaver had broken in 2. Ironfoot stood transfixed, staring at the broken sword. Then he proclaimed, "Little Shaver, forged in the Silver Hills, I lost all count of the men you killed. Now Ironfoot no longer can bite the dust with you in his hand." So saying, Ironfoot hurled the broken sword over the side of the ship. He then turned to Magnhild and Arnhild and said, "The gods seem to will that this day I go unarmed. So, unarmed I go." At this the men began to murmur in protest, but a look from Ironfoot told them that it would be unwise to speak up. Gunnar Badger implored him to at least take with him a carpenter's axe, if nothing else, but Ironfoot refused to listen. Instead, together with his daughters, Ironfoot descended into the hold. No one knows for sure what happened in the stranded slavers' hold that fateful morning, as not one of those who were there ever said a word about it. Only Halvar Eagle, Gunnar Badger, Arnfinn the One-Eyed and Birger Oceanman would mention how that morning on the sandbanks of the beach, Ironfoot and his daughters had gone unarmed into the slavers' hold to confront the unknown. As Arnfinn the One-Eyed told the tale, one and all were convinced that they had seen the last of their chieftain and his daughters when they disappeared below, and Gunnar Badger ordered his men to prepare to storm the hold the moment they heard the sound of fighting. But they never did. At first there was a deathly silence that seemed to last forever. Then they heard Magnhild and Arnhild singing. No one sang as they did. They sang as one, an old and well-loved song from Boland. But with their nerves already at breaking point, the song made the men's blood run cold. It was a song without words. The 2 voices wove in and out like swallows in the evening sky. Without realizing it, the men on deck slowly lowered their axes. Arnfinn, Gunnar, Halvar, Torgir and Brynjar were never able to agree on how long the song lasted, though with the passage of time it appeared to have continued for many days. In point of fact, it took the time it did, and no more. Afterwards, everything was quiet, until the men on deck heard the sound of an iron foot on the stairway. When their chieftain came into sight, he had in his arms what seemed to be a child, leaner and darker skinned than any of them, and with a mass of black hair trailing across his face. In Ironfoot's strong arms, the child looked frail and helpless, but also peaceful. Without a word, Ironfoot stood facing his men. They could see that he was a totally different man from the one who had gone down into the hold. "My son Thord," he shouted in a voice that reverberated from the Nistron cliffs. "My son Thord has come back."